Okay, I do apologize for the rather abrupt ending of my last rant, but it just kind of went off into so many different tangents and all over the place that I just didn't I didn't pay close enough attention to the amount of time I was taking, and it kind of went overboard. Anyway, one of the things I promised to get into last time, which I didn't get around to, but I will this time once I stop rambling about nothing, is where exactly do I get this lowest common denominator scenario theory from? That's one thing that Jay was asking me in the comments was, you know, I think you're way off base, dude. I haven't seen any examples of this. Where are you coming from? Okay, I do come from, you know, what the heck? Oh, and I was having a shower over there, and I heard these strange sounds coming from the shower. And it was her squeezing the last few drops of shampoo out of the bottle. Just kind of like... I was getting a little concerned there. Anyway, where does it come from? Okay, well, Jay, as a fellow retro freak, I think you'll be able to appreciate this. I don't know if you ever used one, but I'm sure you've heard of the Amiga series of computers. Now, going back a bit, in the mid to late 80s, the best-selling computer system in the world, bar none, and it held that title for a very long time, was the Commodore 64. Now, the Commodore 64 was, you know, was pretty good in its day. It had a lot of great games. It was easy to use. You could buy them cheap, and everybody loved them. I personally had an Apple IIc, but all my friends had Commodore 64s. Both systems, I thought, both computers had their strengths and weaknesses. The Apple IIc was really easy to use. Everything auto-booted, so you just pop a disk in and boot it up and you're ready to go. The Commodore 64, however, had, at the time, much superior graphics and sound capabilities. And to this day, I still enjoy listening to Commodore 64 music occasionally. So anyway, fast forward a few years. It comes time for, you know, the world's changing, the world's evolving, the world's technology, as it always does. And Commodore wants the next generation to come out. So they come out with the Amiga. The Amiga 1000 was the very first computer. I'm going to spare you the whole history of the Amiga. Suffice to say, it was a kick-ass computer, and one of the things it was really good at was games. This was at a time when the fastest processor available generally for PCs, or the most commonly used one, was a 286, and that was considered fast. And, you know, most computers didn't have more than 640 kilobytes of memory. The Amiga, you could have, it started with a base amount of 512 kilobytes of memory, but the thing that set it apart from PCs and Macintoshes was the fact that it had all these other chips on the motherboard that did all this cool stuff. Whereas other systems had to do all the operating system functions and all the hardware controlling functions off the software. The Amiga had actual hardware on the motherboard that would handle all of that. It would handle all the grunt functions of the computer, just the typical everyday stuff that it needed to do, running the disk drives, memory management, all these different things on the hardware. It even had what they called a ROM chip, see, that would plug in, that had all the most commonly used functions of the operating system in it, which meant it didn't have to keep hitting the hard drive, or hitting the floppy disk as the case may be, to access system information to let you continue on your stuff. It would just pull it off this chip, and you'd be good to go. The only thing that was in the like software-based was the actual environment itself, the sort of like a Windows-style environment. It was called the workbench. And so you'd load up the workbench, but all the grunt work, once again, was coming off the chips, which meant it was blazingly fast. Now, turning our focus to games, which is really the relevant thing. Okay, so the reason I tell you about the hardware is basically it also had hardware that could handle sound, and it had hardware that was specifically geared towards graphics. This was years before the concept of graphics cards even began, okay? It started, really, on the Amiga. The Amiga was the first one to do that kind of thing. It had a 4096 color palette when everybody else was struggling to manage 16 colors. And it could display all 4096 colors simultaneously. There was no other computer on the market like it. The reason it failed? Well, essentially, chalk it up to bad marketing. And the fact that, you know, it was kind of like the Beta versus VHS thing, where Beta lost out to VHS because Sony refused to license the technology. Sony was the sole manufacturer of Beta. Whereas JVC, the inventor of VHS, licensed it out to anybody who wanted it. So everybody and their dog was making VHS machines, which drove the prices down, which made it competitive, better for the consumer, better for everybody. So everybody went VHS. It was the same thing with the Amiga. PCs, the technology was farmed out to whoever wanted to build PCs. So you had clones everywhere. Cheap as borscht. Software everywhere. Cheap as borscht. Whereas the Amiga, the Commodore was the only company making it. So in the end, it failed through bad marketing and just, you know, not taking notice of the PC clone revolution and basically getting left by the wayside. But in its heyday, okay, in its heyday, the Amiga kicked ass at games. And one of the things it was really good at, because of all the extra hardware and because of the just blazing speed of it, thanks to all the extra hardware, it could really do arcade games well. And it could really do anything that was graphically intensive and speed intensive. You'd see stuff like, years later, you'd see stuff like this on the Super Nintendo and everything, but we were seeing the same kind of thing on the Amiga, like stereo sound and stuff like that, and parallax scrolling and scaling and rotation effects and stuff that was considered pretty advanced in its day, years before everybody else. So, you know, us Amiga users consider ourselves to be pretty elite, you know, an elite niche class of computer user with this well-kept secret. We didn't want it to be a secret. We wanted it to take off, but unfortunately it didn't. So where the lowest common denominator scenario comes in. Okay, now that I've sort of given you an encapsulated history of the Amiga and why it rocked, most Amigas, as a base, would come with all the hardware that I mentioned built in. So you didn't have to add anything to it. It was just all built in, and a single floppy drive, no hard drive, and 512 kilobytes of memory. Now that's laughable by today's standards, but back then it was considered decent. Okay. So here was the problem. Even though you could get memory expansions, even though there were higher-end models of the Amiga that came with hard drives standard, even though you could get hard drive expansions for the lower-end Amigas that didn't come with them standard, games were rarely, if ever, installable to the hard drive, and rarely, if ever, took advantage of extra memory. I used to subscribe to pretty much every Amiga magazine under the sun. I was just an Amiga freak in the day. And I would see people writing in all the time, like even like up to the mid-90s when the platform was dying, saying like, what is with the games manufacturers? Why aren't they putting hard drive installability into this? Why aren't they taking advantage of the extra memory? Why aren't we seeing more games that use the 4096 color mode? That would kick VGA's ass! The reason? The lowest common denominator. Because the majority of people out there, the majority of Amiga users had the baseline model with a single floppy drive and 512 kilobytes of memory. So even though it was possible to do stuff that would take advantage of others, and I mean, come on, it couldn't have taken that much effort to put hard drive installability into a game, right? Well, yes and no. Software piracy was at an all-time high during this point in time. So game manufacturers were pretty paranoid about getting their games ripped off. The funny thing is it didn't matter, because the hackers and crackers would find a way around any kind of copy protection they could throw at them. But, so what they would do is they would have all these custom boot systems and these custom copy protection systems that meant the only way the computer would be able to read any data off the disk is if you booted from that disk. So if you tried to just copy the files over to your hard drive and do it manually, it would just get garbage if it got anything at all. So it just couldn't be done. There was like so many factors involved, but basically the bottom line is that's where it comes from. That's where my paranoia about the lowest common denominator scenario comes from, because I've seen it happen. It happened big time on the Amiga, and gamers suffered for it. So we had these awesome games, but that sometimes were 5 or 6 discs in size. And some of them wouldn't even take advantage of the fact if you have multiple disk drives. Like a lot of times you'd have the program on one disk, and then say the remaining 5 disks, or 5 disks, program on one disk, remaining 5 disks would be data. So if you kept your program disk in one drive, you could just swap the data disks, and it wasn't so bad because it didn't have to access the data disks as often, just like when you go to a different section of the game or whatever. But more often than not, you just have to keep swapping disks constantly, and it was a pain in the ass. So there was justifiable reasons for people wanting stuff to be installable, and you know, it just didn't happen. And then, well, eventually Commodore went bankrupt, the Amiga disappeared. It's still around. Like, you can actually still buy Amiga computers. If you go actually to this website right here, Software Hut, but their website name is abbreviated. If you go there, you can actually buy brand new Amiga computers. Amazing, eh? And there is still some limited development, but it's basically a hobby thing now. It's just not around anymore. So anyway, because I've seen it happen to such a ridiculous extent on the Amiga, and seeing how much it hurt gaming on that platform and hurt its chances to be a more viable platform for a lot of people. So I'm sure the lack of hard drive installability for games and such was a big deterrent for people to even consider it as a viable gaming platform. When PCs at the time, everything was hard drive installable. Absolutely everything. It was huge. But the Amiga got left behind. And I'm not saying that the Xbox 360 and the PS3 are going to get left behind, but my fear is, because I've seen this happen, where it's like, well, you know, it's less work for us to just develop for the lowest common denominator than to try to cater to everybody, that I just don't want to see that happen again, with, especially now, like now that we're on the edge of this new frontier, and there's so much potential. There's so much potential. I just hate to see it all wasted, you know, because of the limitations of a storage format. But, I mean, the flip side of that is maybe we'll start to see more PS3 exclusives, more stuff that's just had so much development poured into it to take full advantage of the PS3's capabilities and storage capacity, that there's just no way in hell they're going to spend their time watering it down for an Xbox 360 version. That's something I'd actually like to see, and that's something I think could actually push the gaming industry forward in that respect. And Xbox will be like, oh shit, we're losing exclusives because of our lack of storage capacity. We better put out a deluxe Xbox with a Blu-ray drive in it. And, you know, hopefully that'll happen. I think it will happen eventually. I mean, as Blu-ray becomes more and more of a standard, maybe not in the 360, maybe it'll be the 720, who knows, whatever. But at some point, an Xbox is going to have a Blu-ray drive in it. There's just no doubt about it. Unless another format comes along that replaces Blu-ray in the next 5 years. Anyway, hope that clears it up for you, Jay, and anybody else who was wondering. That's kind of where I'm coming from. Basically, because I've seen that type of scenario occur on the Amiga, and it was very frustrating for me as an Amiga gamer and someone who really wanted... Because I have both the low-end Amiga and the mid-range Amiga. Sorry, Annette is just walking by over there. And I have games for both. Some of the later ones were hard drive installable, but as a general rule, they weren't. So, I mean, sometimes you'd get games that were literally 12 discs in size, and you had to swap discs constantly. No. No, thank you. Anyway, that's it for HD Rant number 6. Hope you enjoyed it.